people of Birmingham have been splashing around in this swimming pool for over a century. It's the kind of local amenity that we all take for granted. But there's something else we take for granted, the idea that swimming is fun.
Before places like this were built, swimming was just a way of stopping your lungs from filling with water if you accidentally fell into a river. Talking about the sport of swimming, regarding it as the same kind of activity as football or cricket, that would have been considered crazy talk.
Now it's the most popular participation sport in Britain, but its first advocates were highly eccentric gentlemen with big facial hair.
So here comes a brief history of swimming, with no jumping, bombing or petting, right?
Dover Beach, at the shingly bottom of our island nation. To be British is to be engirdled by spume. And yet, when Britannia ruled the waves, most of us were afraid to go into the water. 150 years ago, the average Briton had all the finely honed swimming abilities of a small piano. But one man changed all that, Captain Matthew Webb. In 1875, he jumped into the water, flapped his arms and legs about, and 22 hours later, he'd made it to France. He kept himself going by drinking beef tea, beer, and brandy. Nowadays, we're used to the idea that people swim the channel, smeared with grease usually. Even people off the telly do it. Before Captain Webb, no one did. And all these years later, he's still revered by people in wet cozzies.
You two are known as the King and the Queen of the Channel. How do you get to be part of a monarchy like that?
Basically swim the channel more times than any other man or any other woman.
So basically. Go on, tell me, how many?
I've done 43 crossings.
And I've done 34. Sickening, isn't
it? Sickening, that isn't the word I'd use. I'd use some word that conveyed the idea of cold and terror, actually. So how has Captain Webb influenced what you do?
I have to admit, he's a hero to me. I named my son after him, you know, my son's Matt. He's the inspiration that started what has become for me a lifetime of sort of a sporting achievement. Everybody said, you can't do it. They laughed at him and said, you know, that's impossible. And yet he stood up and said, I can do this. And he went and proved it.
So that's why he's an inspirational figure then, because of this sort of self-belief.
Yeah. Oh, yes, definitely. You know, Matthew Webb set off the precedent, just did it in hat and costume, basically.
And you'll find that channel swimmers are equally disparaging now of people in rubber suits or wetsuits.
But why can't you do it in a wetsuit?
Wetsuits are for wimps.
Yeah. It would be a lot easier in a wetsuit, and a lot more people would be doing it in a wetsuit.
It's you against it, and if you put a wetsuit on, where do you stop? You could put flippers on. Oh, how about getting in the boat and floating across?
Ferry, maybe.
Yeah, maybe the ferry.
You're a star.
Well, Matthew Webb didn't wear a wetsuit, so not away.
Captain Webb also did his crossing with a hangover, didn't he? I mean, he had 8 whiskies the night before and a huge cooked breakfast on the morning. Is that a technique that you follow?
Well, no. Now, you know, the actual no is alcohol in long distance.
Yeah, because we know now it thins the blood.
Yes, it actually makes you feel colder. I don't know how he did it, to be honest.
Is this a peculiarly British way of having fun, do you think?
I think there's about 30% British. We did the other day. We worked out 30% British, 30% American, and then the rest of the world is like the other.
Not many
40%.
French, though, oddly enough.
Very few French people, yeah.
Why is that, do you think?
Bit of common sense, maybe.
To the British public, Captain Webb was a hero. A big, stinking, porpoise oil-smeared hero. Even the Daily Telegraph went all giddy for him, declaring that he was probably the best-known and most popular man in the world.
Webb was one of the first superstar sportsmen. People just wanted to look at him and cheer. The stock exchange gave him money, just gave it to him because they thought he was great, and he spent it with all the prudence and restraint of a Premiership footballer. His image was used to sell all kinds of things, like these matches.
But after a while, the adulation dribbled away, and so did the money. Webb began to do mad things for cash. He floated motionless for 128 hours in an aquarium. like a Victorian David Blaine, except people didn't chuck burgers at him.
Just 8 years after he made his slippery progress across the Channel, Webb was dead.
Desperate for another hit of fame and funds, he attempted to swim across the rapids of Niagara. He was smashed to death in a whirlpool.
It took 36 years before anyone else made it from Dover to Calais without a paddle. And despite the nature of his death, Captain Webb had persuaded a generation of Britons that there was more to do in the water than drown.
Webb was one of the reasons why elaborate water palaces appeared throughout the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Balsall Heath Baths in Birmingham are the finest example still in use. The building reflects the prosperity and confidence of the height of empire, but also the social divisions of the time.
That's where you went in if you were a first-class man. These days, class difference is legible in much more subtle ways, like postcodes and house prices and how big your telly is. But when Edward VII was on the throne, they made it much more easy for you to know your place by chiselling it over the door.
Different classes enter different lobbies. Nowadays, the rich segregate themselves by joining private gyms. 100 years ago, a maze of glazed brick passages kept the classes apart and protected the rich from being glimpsed in the buff by the poor. If you paid the premium, you got to swim in here. Of course, in those days it had water in. There were still people scooting through the first-class pool until 2005, when the balcony began to totter from the effects of corrosion.
Like most pools of its age, this one's in need of a bit of expensive loving care. The building's listed, so there's no danger of the bulldozers moving in, but nobody yet knows whether anyone will actually swim in this pool again.
Even with the scaffolding up and the water out, you can still get a sense of just how classy this first-class swimming environment was. The pool still in use today was previously merely for second-class patrons. It's a bit plainer, there's nowhere for spectators to sit, and it's smaller. You got what you paid for.
And you weren't just charged for your preference in tile work, your tolerance to filth also had a price.
Balsall Heath Baths featured a welcome innovation when they opened in 1907, a system for cleaning the water. These are original Edwardian filter tanks full of sand. Before filtration arrived, pools had to be completely emptied every few days, then scrubbed down and filled up again with clean water.
If you came just after scrub down day, then you paid top whack to scud through the bright, sparkling water. A few days later, once sweat and grime and snot had begun to turn the water as cloudy and tangy as ginger beer, then prices tumbled. Later still, just before the pool was about to be emptied, and swimmers were essentially stroking through a bisto of human effluvia, they let the kiddies in for a penny dip.
Now that might sound like a good way of catching a nasty skin complaint, but actually a drive for cleanliness had been one of the key reasons why public pools were built in the first place. Balsall Heath still has some original slipper baths, just like the ones most of us have at home these days.
As the name suggests, public baths had originally been built as places to get clean, places where the great unwashed could come and douche themselves. Disease, you see, had been one of the consequences of the growth of big industrial towns and cities. And where there was brass, there was muck. And where there was muck, there was vomiting and cholera and rice water stools.
To tackle these epidemics, an 1846 Act of Parliament made local councils responsible for improving personal hygiene. The first public bath buildings didn't have swimming facilities at all, just individual tubs. These are now the oldest surviving slipper baths in the country. People sponged themselves off in here for almost a century. This little card advised Edwardian bathers how to summon an attendant. This board told staff who needed more hot water and who couldn't find the soap. Swimming pools had originally been an afterthought. They evolved from the plunge pools which appeared in the 1850s. Big communal tubs were cheaper to run because people shared the hot water, but they also happened to be big enough for a bit of breaststroke. By the time Balsall Heath was built, 60-odd years after that first legislation, Britain had thousands of public baths, nearly all of them run by local councils. A good pool was a badge of municipal pride, just like the Free Public Library, which is part of the same building.
Unlike any sport before it, swimming was effectively state-sponsored, and supply created demand. The pools were built, and lo, people took their kit off and swam. It had been a leap of faith, but it had worked.
Whoa! That's freezing.
The British had become so mad for swimming, they were willing to ignore an obvious fact about the country we live in, all that brass monkey weather. Tooting Lido in South London is 100 feet wide and 300 feet long, the largest freshwater pool in Britain. It was built in 1906, and it's an early example of the open-air facilities which were sunk throughout Britain in the decades before the Second World War. Over a century since its creation, people still swim here, all year round. Early on an April Sunday, it's chilly enough just standing on the side. That's me, feeling their pain.
How's that for you?
Bracing.
Is bracing the word?
Absolutely. No, that's great when you get out.
So where's the fun in it then? What's
Getting
the pleasure?
out.
Is it really? Is that?
Absolutely.
But is it fun?
I enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
In what way?
Feel nice and tingly now and refreshed, ready for the day.
The Lido's synonymous with sort of old people that are not old.
The swimming club here has members well into their 80s, but then keeping people alive and kicking is what these places were designed for. The same justification used in the early years of the public bath movement.
But now it wasn't just about delousing the British public, it was about making them more athletic, more vigorous, and that was better done outdoors, in the fresh air, no matter how cold it was.
The 30s made fitness into a fetish of the state. The Nazis were particularly keen on it. As well as all that sea heiling, you touched your toes for the fatherland. But this isn't Nuremberg you're looking at. It's the Wirral. It's the New Brighton Lido, with the water taken out and replaced with clean-limbed youths. It's not that British Lidos were ever going to be the birthing pools for a master race, but they were part of an ideological crusade. Many, including Tooting, were job creation schemes. Unemployed? Why not dig a dirty great hole in the ground? It's Keynesian economics at work. And there was something socialist in the architecture too. Unlike in the indoor pools, rich and poor swam together. That didn't mean they liked each other though.
People wrote snotty letters to the council. I suppose that's one of the things that councils are for. One, outraged of Tooting, was disgusted at having to share the water with boys and men, filthy in both clothes and person. Another one complained that the pool had been stormed by the riffraff from slumland. The council was also asked to point out that it was forbidden to gob in the water.
Recent letters to the council about the Lido were more likely to be pleading with them not to shut it down and fill it with concrete. Now it relies on volunteers to run it for much of the year. But at least it's still here. There were once over 300 Lidos in Britain. Now there are less than 100. They cost a fortune to run, and in recent years they've had to compete with those whoop-de-doo leisure pools with flumes and wave machines and roofs and radiators.
Today we're all getting fatter, I know I am, and the government tells us to eat more vegetables and to get off the bus one stop early. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the state had better ideas than that. They sent in the plumbers and the builders, and they built us somewhere to swim. These places are concrete and grouting symbols of what the relationship between the people and the state can be, and that's why they deserve to be saved.